First of all, thank you all for being here, and for those of you who are on Zoom. Today we are very happy to have Jennifer Dunn here with us. Jennifer is an associate professor of chemical and biological engineering at Northwestern University. She also has a potency appointment in the mechanical engineering at Northwestern. She's associate director of the Northwestern-Argonne Institute of Science and Engineering, and also the Associate Director of Northwestern Center for Engineering, Sustainability, and Resilience.
Actually, long names.
Very, very long names indeed. So her PhD was from chemical engineering from the University of Michigan. And actually we had a very interesting conversation yesterday because I was actually convinced that she did her PhD at Penn State because her former PhD advisor is Fickle. Right? You're going to meet this afternoon. But instead, she did it at the University of Michigan. And undergraduate degree in chemical engineering from Purdue, which we also discussed yesterday over dinner. And she's had a very, very interesting and unconventional career with positions in government consulting and academia. And so it's going to be really great to hear from Jennifer and see how she navigated all these different transitions and what she's learned. I think you mentioned in your little bio, I discovered the pros and cons of working in different environments and what work environments works best for me. So we really want to hear that. And thank you very much for joining us in person.
Yeah,
thanks.
Absolutely, my pleasure to be here. So I figured that, since I've kind of had this strange, abnormal, different, unconventional career path, now I'm at the sort of life stage where I feel like maybe this could be helpful to other people to share it. So I'm happy to have this opportunity to give the Experiential seminar. So I call it Fickle or fine tuning because I have changed positions probably more than the average PhD, and so it might look strange, like why would I do that? Oops, my mouse is going. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. So this is the career trajectory that I had, and so basically I'm starting off as an undergrad, but I think that's important because I was part of Purdue's cooperative education program, so I had some insight into what a BS level engineer would be doing day to day. I went to grad school, postdoc, and then I went to the US EPA in Chicago for a while, then to consulting, and then to Argon National Laboratory at Department of Energy Lab, and then I came to Northwestern. So then I kind of walked through the different pieces of that, and again, how I learned kind of about myself through this trajectory. So when I was at Purdue, I took part in their cooperative education program. I worked at a medical packaging facility. So they made things like dental pouches that they sterilize, the dental instruments they're going to use. They made biohazard bags. They made other types of bags that contain surgical kits that you rip open. So I learned a lot about polymers, polymer properties, polymer processing, which turns out now that everybody's very into a circular economy of plastics, that kind of background actually ended up being really helpful. But I kind of learned like day to day what life as an engineer in a production facility was like. And I worked with the customers of this medical packaging company. I worked with the vendors, so I kind of had a perspective on also their worlds. So like one of our vendors was Exxon, and their salespeople would come and tell us about their new resins. So I feel like that experience helped me kind of see this landscape of conventional engineering. One of the most important things, awesome, I'm on slide 3. One of the most important aspects of that experience was my immediate supervisor, who was female and had 2 children. And I kind of watched her and I thought, if she can do this whole thing and be a mother, then I eventually will also be able to do this. And I remember now as an older person, I think back, okay, that's representation. Like having representation, someone I could look to who was doing the kind of life experience that I myself wanted, I saw it as possible. So that was very important. But while in some ways in that position, I generated new knowledge that okay, this new formulation will work for this packaging product, I wasn't creating new knowledge in the same way that you do in research. And I realized that experience that I really wanted to be more like at the forefront of science and engineering. And that's one reason that I went forward to get my PhD. So you're all in grad school now. But I knew that I wanted to work in like the broad environmental space, but I wasn't really sure how to do that as a chemical engineer. It was like 1999. green chemistry is kind of like just getting off the ground as a concept. I learned nothing about chemical engineers' impact on the environment in chemical engineering courses at Purdue. I took one environmental engineering course where I learned more about wastewater treatments. But I really felt like I just didn't have any concept, and this is something I really wanted to work on. So when I did interviews at grad schools and I met Phil Savage at Michigan, he had a green chemistry project, and I was like, this is what I want to work on. So I accepted Michigan's offer, and then I jockeyed around to try and get on that project with Professor Savage. And I told my friends, I really want that project, but I think I was really, it's interesting like how you have these matches. Like I think I was the one that identified the most strongly with that project. So I got to work on that. And through that, again, it was green chemistry was still kind of a newer area. And so I was one of the first green chemistry fellows through the American Chemical Society. I got to go to the first International Green Chemistry Conference in Japan, which was awesome. So it was a really, great experience. But all the while I'm thinking like, what do I want to do when I finish? As I'm sure many of you are thinking. And I thought about a lot of different options. Part of my grad work was funded by BP. So I was somewhat interested in going into industry, but then I also kind of had this, like I'd like to go into academia, I'd like to teach, I'd like to build a research group. So I basically interviewed kind of all over the place. But as I was going forward, the one thing that kept coming out of my mind is that to me, my family is really the most important thing. And what you're missing out on is a beautiful picture. I am from the Chicago area. I grew up there. My parents lived there. I'm an only child. If I'm not around my parents, there's no one else to help them out or to be like part of their life. And my in-laws also lived near Chicago, about 2 hours away. I was married when I finished graduate school. So, and I, as an only child, I also lived very close to my grandparents. And my grandparents were a very important part of my life growing up. And so I wanted that same thing for my kids. So we had the kind of the luxury of being able to move to Chicago, where we didn't have kids yet, so I was planning like very far in advance. But we figured, let's go somewhere where we can both be and establish a career. And it's a metropolitan area, there's going to be lots of options. So let's just go get started. And to be honest with you, I was very nervous about this, but Professor Savage told me, he's like, look, you're going to go, you're going to get started, things will change, kind of like you'll figure it out. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. And I have two boys, and they have indeed both spent a lot of time with their grandparents. So that was, I guess, without knowing it as a 20-something, that was one of my main life objectives. It's come true. It's my in-laws, my parents, my kids, which is an older picture now. I couldn't find, I'm like, I need more pictures of family. But my older son is 14 now, so he's obviously older than that little kid sitting in my lap. But yeah, so this was one of my most important life goals, and it came true. So the career stuff I kind of built around that. So from Michigan, I went to UIC, University of Illinois Chicago, to do a postdoc, and it was in combustion chemistry. And we were really zoomed in on figuring out the current parameters for various kinetic equations to do with combustion. And I went to a conference, and someone was saying they've been working on this rate constant since 1946, and I was sitting there thinking, I just don't know if this is the right thing for me. Like, I don't know if I can zoom in on like one area for a long time. And I really wanted to do like policy relevant work. I mean, part because I met a science policy guy in that fellowship thing I had from the ACS. So I also taught during my postdoc, and I was like, okay, I can do this. I can teach an engineering class at the college level. I'm good. But it was helpful to be in Chicago where I wanted to live. So I started doing a lot of networking. And I actually, for the class that I taught, I had the students do a project that involved the US EPA office in Chicago. So I kind of called them up. I'm like, I have this class. I want to do projects. Do you have anything they could work on? And they gave me some ideas. And we did it, which led to my next job. But as a postdoc, I had sort of a different postdoc than many of you. I actually had a fair amount of free time. And I'm like, looking back, I'm like, oh my gosh, there were so many things I could have dumped that free time because I don't have much free time now. But I wish I had used that more, but oh well. But anyways, so I had done this networking with US EPA, and then it turns out they had jobs coming up. So I am on next one.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I applied for a position at EPA Region 5 in Chicago. And again,
I've always had this fascination with how science is used in policy that continues to this day. And in that job, I had the role and part of communicating science to people who led the agency, mostly at the regional level, but also some at headquarters. And it, they are looking at a very high level picture of things. And so you have to get good at condensing things, science concepts, into very concise and clear language. And that was a challenge I really enjoyed. EPA has their mission is to protect human health and the environment. And what I found working there was that people really sign on to that mission. And so did I. Like, that mission was a great fit for me. But what was less of a great fit was kind of like the pace of work. I was like ready to go faster than was possible to go there. And I also was looking for more career advancement in the shorter term. And that wasn't necessarily an option there. So people that I worked with who stayed, which was most people, they are now getting into management positions and stuff. Whereas at Argon, I was able to do that faster, as I'll explain. So I was getting a little bit frustrated with career advancement, and I was also kind of feeling like I wasn't using my technical skills as much as I wanted to. So I ended up taking a position at a consulting firm where they assured me that I would be using all those skills. So I worked in the air services division and did a bunch of air permitting, but I liked better the projects where I was working with companies to help identify ways to cut their emissions. So I did a project with United, looking at like, okay, we idle our airplanes all the time. We have to drive them around. Like, what can we do to really reduce our emissions? Mostly they were concerned at the time about air pollutant emissions, not so much the greenhouse gas side of things. And the URS was interested in starting to build a life cycle assessment practice. So I was helping with that, and that was fun. They were willing to let me go spend a year in Belgium because my husband had to do that for his job. And so I had like the best time for that year, because also they're like, you can come, but we really only have enough work for you to do that. Like, so you have to work part-time. I was like, okay, because I had a very young child. And that year it was like a golden year because we traveled a lot. And I got to spend a lot of time with my son and learn how to be a parent, because I really had no clue, and I still honestly sometimes don't. But the thing about daily life as a consultant is like everything is driven by the clients. You have to write proposals just like in academia, but you're really competing with other consulting firms on very tight budgets and deadlines. So, people have this conception that academia is like exceptionally difficult, and it is in terms of like the hours, but consulting is also very time intensive. And you have kind of like a little bit less freedom, right? Because you're just driven by, you need to figure out what your clients need and then propose. I did spend time doing analysis and writing, which was my favorite part. And I also had some people who worked for me eventually. The other thing I did here was I took project management training. So I learned about budgets, schedules, invoicing, all these things that actually come in handy later on if you're trying to build a research group. So this whole thing about staying in Chicago, right? So when I was at UIC, UIC has an Institute for Environmental Science and Policy, and their leader, the person who directs that institute, invited me to join their advisory board while I was at the consulting firm. And I said, sure, fine. And I'm looking at the list of who else is on the board. And one of the people was Michael Wong at Argon National Laboratory, who leads the life cycle assessment group there. And I was like, oh, I'll get to meet him. And I had used the model that they built for some stuff I was doing at EPA and at the consulting firm. So we went to a meeting, and I was in line for coffee, like right behind him. And I was like, okay, here we go. I'm not a big networking person, but I was like, gotta do it. So I said, oh, you're Michael Wong from Argon. I've used GREET, your model. And it's really a valuable tool. And he's like, he's like, yeah. And he's like, yeah, we're just like really busy. We really need to bring on more staff. Do you know anyone? And I was like, oh my gosh, is this happening? So I was like, yes, I know. I said, yes, I would be interested in, considering a position in your group. And he's like, all right, well, send me your resume. Blah, blah. So literally within a month, I was out working at Argon as a staff member there. And life cycle assessment became my everyday. So I really got to immerse myself, and I was back into research and analysis and writing. And I like mentally felt like, okay, like I came home. Like I thought that I was okay with moving on from research. But once I got back into it, I was like, yeah, this is actually like where I like to be. So I was very happy. I had the chance to lead a group, and I had a chance to serve as the relationship manager between one office of DOE, the bioenergy office, and Argon. So I was kind of trying to coordinate everything. When DOE needs something, they would call me first for this particular area. And so it was all very good experience to really get to see how DOE works and how the labs work with DOE. I had a ton of travel. I was gone very often. And that was a little bit challenging being a parent of fairly young children. They're of course aging as I go through all this stuff, but they were still pretty young. And basically, instead of having private companies as your customer, the National Labs, the Department of Energy is your customer. When they want something, you will do it as fast as possible. And they may want something different tomorrow than they wanted yesterday, and like that's okay. We're gonna do whatever it is you need. So it's in some ways having that consulting background gave me sort of the right mindset for working in this capacity, as opposed to like, I don't know, having always been in a national lab, because honestly, the nature of work at a national lab has really changed in the past 10 to 15 years. There's a lot more project planning, reporting. When I started, it was starting to happen and people were a little bit overwhelmed by it. And I was like, well, I took all this project management training. And so that became very valuable to my employer at Argon because I knew how to do all that stuff. I started getting into like strategy for both the biomass office, but also Argon in terms of where we should put our resources for the future. So that was also fun. The cool thing about national labs is when you work at one, you get to know people at most of them. And so I had this really nice community that I still keep in touch with, but not as much as I would like. I'm at the other national labs. And it was just a great community of science, very dedicated people, a lot of fun. A lot, before the pandemic, a lot of getting together, meetings and stuff, but then we would always have a good time together. So that was very, very valuable. Again, the national lab is still a lot of very difficult work. So if you're thinking like, I don't want to be in academia because it's a lot of hours, I would just say it tends to be a lot of hours, like no matter where you go. Because I was worried about that before I had kids. I was like, I don't know if I can handle this. And it turns out I actually can. I just learned how to do it in other places besides academia. So over time at Argon, I was doing a lot with biofuels, and I was starting to feel like I cannot think of one more interesting research question to ask about biofuels. I feel like I've like covered it. And I was just starting to kind of stagnate. And I realized now this is why people go on sabbaticals after like 7 years or so, because you need to like rejuvenate your thinking. And then I was also just feeling like the area I was in was not of strategic importance to the lab necessarily. At a lab like the National Renewable Energy Lab, biofuels are huge. But Argon is a basic science lab. So the type of work I was doing, wasn't physics. And physics, like the sciences, engineers are a little bit like lower on the ladder than scientists at Argon. And I was feeling like I just need to do something a little different if I want to advance up the ladder here. So then a friend from a different national lab sent me a position announcement for the director of research at this institute, and I took it. So basically I went over to Northwestern as the director of research for this institute, and I started trying to build collaborations. And this was a lot of proposals, workshops, bringing people together, but I still maintained with about 25% of my time, my own research program. And I got to work with undergraduate students. I really got to know a lot of faculty in Northwestern, which is a lot smaller than Penn State, right? So I kind of built a really nice network at Northwestern without even really realizing that's what I was doing. So this was all really good. And then eventually the chemie department had a position open up, and I knew them and they knew me, and they said, hey, like, why don't you consider applying? So all of a sudden I was kind of back to my 20s again, thinking about like, well, like, do I want to do this like real academic position? And I did apply, and obviously worked out. But the reasons I was kind of willing to take this step now is, first of all, I knew that department and I know they're great. And I was like, this is a great culture that I want to be a part of. I almost felt like it's going into like a law firm or a consulting firm when you're going to be a partner. Like I was ready to be a partner with these people and advance the department. I'm also just more comfortable as a multifaceted person, a parent, a professional. Like I feel like I'm in a better space than I was in my 20s when I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. And also the field that I'm in are becoming increasingly important. And I feel like how did this work out that, in 2004, when I graduated, I was having to kind of really explain LCA, and now people are really wanting it. So it's a pretty interesting time to be doing this. So this is kind of my best advice as you're thinking about your career path. like the most important thing, every job I got was actually because either intentionally or unintentionally, I had built a network that either came to me with an opportunity or I could reach out to for one. And then I think the reason people were kind of willing to bring me on board is that I always just did my best work, right? So they knew if she does good work, she's reliable, she's blah, blah, blah. So they were willing to give me chances and open doors for me. I think you never need to look at any decision you make as your final decision, which can be kind of frustrating because you might want like permanency or the kind of resolution or lack of uncertainty. But I think keeping an open mind is really important. Also, finding people you like to work with is really important because at the end of the day, like the science is great, but the people is harder. So when you find your people, they can help get you through either challenging science times or other people who can be challenging. You need your people to lean on. So yeah, I'll just say that like, I changed jobs a lot. I definitely did not plan to do that. Like when I landed at EPA, I'm like, I've got a government job, I'm set, like I'm good. We're gonna do this, we're fine. But then that's just not, turns out that's not what really fit me best. So starting over every time has been hard. You have to impress people again, demonstrate yourself again, but also you learn more stuff and you meet more people. And overall, I think like it's gone pretty well. So now I'm in my next chapter and we'll see how it goes. So I think that's all I had. Oh, this is my conclusion. Yeah, so I would say like, I think people often feel a lot of pressure, like at the end of grad school, like I gotta find my path right now. But in reality, you still have a whole career ahead of you and you can kind of define it for yourself more than you think you might be able to. I'm now done. I'm happy to take questions.
There you go. Yeah, this is the last slide. Thank you very much, Jennifer.
Oh, I'm sorry. You had no idea that I was
No, I
advancing.
was I've gone through
Oh, I'm sorry. I should have.
I think it was very good.
Okay.
Very, very good. There was no need for a
Okay.
PowerPoint presentation, so thank you so much.
Okay.
This picture, where did you take this picture?
This is in Olympic National Park.
Aha.
Yeah, outside Seattle.
Wow.
We got to go there in July. So very lovely
That's
area.
very nice.
On this very trail, I ran into another Northwestern faculty member just out of the blue. I was like, Susan? So, yeah.
Do we want to open it for questions from the
Oh,
audience? And then
yeah, I did not.
take a look if there's any- Well, you have control over Zoom, I think.
Yeah, I can
So
see
you
the
can see-
chat. There's no questions yet.
So let's see, if does anybody have any questions here in the room?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So thank you for your talk. And I was wondering, do you think it's easier to, like as a career path, get back into academia if you first start working for like government organizations and national labs, or do you think if you kind of go into industry from grad school that it's kind of been harder to get back into academia at a later time?
I have seen more people go from the national labs to academia than from industry to academia. Yeah, at Northwestern alone, I think we have like 3 or 4 that I know of. I'm sure there are more that came from different national labs. And I think that at the national lab, you have that opportunity to build your research portfolio and publish in a way that you won't have at industry. That's what makes it harder. One of the things that makes it harder. But that said, I mean, I think we all also know people who transitioned over from industry. You might want to have like a shorter time there. Yeah.
The other questions, unfortunately, I'm unable to see
Oh.
the chat room here on my end.
Oh, no,
So
really?
It seems, yes. I don't know why. it
I
doesn't
see
show
one
me.
question about
Yeah, so if you don't
Argon.
mind, just take a look at the questions and then maybe you can share them with us.
Yeah, no problem.
Tell us what.
I can see a couple of them as well.
Right, yeah.
There's one from Tyler about whether Argon will need any energy engineers in 2023. And I would say yes. Yes, they will. But in a national lab, typically you do need a PhD. So it's important to get that PhD. But not only Argon, but I think all of the national labs, you know, they are Department of Energy labs. So I'm looking at this like the camera's here. It's not. So they will need energy engineers, so energy storage, conversion of various stuff like biomass or plastics or to energy. And there's still nuclear programs at the national labs as well.
The other questions from you guys?
You had gone into academia kind of right away in the 20s. Do you think you would have been kind of happy, or do you enjoy the path that you spent to get back to academia now?
I think that honestly, like being at the national lab for that period of time, it really helped because you don't teach. So that obviously saves a lot of time. And so you're really able to fully explore your research. And I think that helped define what I'm really interested in. Now I did a pretty short postdoc and in an area that I wasn't convinced that was really for me. So if I had gone and done a postdoc in a different area, it might have been different. I did look at Northwestern for postdocs and stuff I'd like to see, but I even asked Linda, who everybody knows, but they just didn't have, there weren't positions open that were a good fit for me. So that didn't work out. So your question was, yeah. So, but on the other hand, I think that having those touch points in those other fields, I'm hoping will help me kind of advise students for what they might be interested in. So I definitely, I'm very fond of many of the people that I met, and I wouldn't give up that year in Belgium for anything. so yeah. Okay, so Varaha writes, I'm sorry, I'm not sure, is a postdoc and looking for building connections with government to ensure we implement policies for the environment. You mentioned they work very slowly. How to speed up the process? Yeah, that is an excellent question. So recently we had a workshop at Northwestern, and I actually invited one of my former colleagues from EPA to be a part of a panel. And she mentioned like the public comment process for new environmental regulations. And so they run these public comment periods, right? So any reg, they put out a public comment period, and then sometimes they have in-person events where they will listen. And it's been part of her job to go and listen. And she said, everybody from Girl Scouts to coal miners showed up at a particular public hearing around green electricity. And, you know, because it's a democracy, it takes time. And I think, unfortunately, like even more so now with like less progress that just made on the Hill overall, like most days it's just fighting as opposed to progress. So I honestly don't know how to speed things up, but one thing I think can help is for scientists and engineers to get more involved in conveying like helpful information. So in my field, I feel like people are barraging policymakers with conflicting information. It's hard to interpret, and I'm sure that's got to slow things down. And honestly, it's mostly their staffers who are working with this information and advising their member of Congress. So one thing you could do is pursue a AAAS policy fellowship after your PhD or your postdoc. I started to go through that process, but then we just decided to move to Chicago because I think having like the best and brightest recent PhDs and postdocs working with agencies and members of Congress, that only helps. So that's one like concrete thing you could do. Oh, cool. Am I working on building policies on plastic pollution? I'm not working on policies. I did testify before two state committees of state houses about plastic systems technology based on an LCA we did. That was also intriguing. There's like the state agencies, it's very different than the federal agency, whole other like worlds. I think that people who testified before me was something about like bow hunting of deer. And then I talked about pyrolysis of plastics. So, it was, you know, it's hard to make sense of it all, but that I would say, I just try to make my analyses, like when I write papers, I try to point out the policy implications, and that's how I try to help. But we're thinking about ways to do that better. Yeah. So,
Questions from you?
I have a question.
Yeah.
How different is it doing research in academia versus at a national lab? Are there any additional like obstacles you encounter at national labs or academia apart from teaching, of course?
Right. So on the research side, the interesting thing about the national labs is it's very Department of Energy driven. So when I was at Argon, for example, you could not touch social justice like with a 10-foot pole. No-go area, don't talk about it, don't do it. And so when I went to Northwestern, I was like, I can talk about social effects now. But that's changing. So now DOE, I mean, you're maybe perhaps more influenced by who's in the White House. So now all of a sudden, everyone in the national labs is doing social justice like overnight. And it's because people were already interested in it and kind of like maybe doing it on the side. And now they were able to like bring it out and say, look, we're doing all this great stuff. But, you know, I did have work that was reworded during the previous administration. So that was, and like there was like, seriously, it took like a month to have stuff reviewed. And that's not, in academia, you have academic freedom, which, but then comes with, I would say it's harder to get funding. So the national labs, I never worried that I wouldn't, you're on soft money, like you have to bring in your money, but you have this direct pipeline from DOE. And if you maintain your relationships with your sponsors, so like you go to Washington or in my case, Golden, Colorado, you chat with them, what's on their mind, and you kind of together come up with like your research agenda, and then they give you money for it. I mean, it has to be good. You can't just propose junk and they'll be like, I don't think so. But at a university, you need to come up with this much more yourself. And that it can be harder, I would definitely say. And sometimes I do kind of miss the kind of, okay, like this is what we're working on for the next, you know, there's a strategic plan in place. This is our next 3 years. But the flip side of that is like, I collaborated with an anthropologist and no one told me I couldn't. I collaborated with a computer engineer on a machine learning thing that would have been potentially out of bounds. Because people are like, well, you don't need to do that. Why are you doing that? But I wanted to, I was curious about it. So I would say on the academic side, you may have more opportunities to kind of just explore your own curiosity than you might on the national lab side, but the national lab side is a little bit more like secure. If that makes sense. And also like they have a graphic artist department. So I definitely miss that. I'm like, oh, because I'm so bad at making these like fancy figures. But yeah. Oh, okay. Question, if one is going into industry, what best practices can help one go back to academia? I mean, to me, it's publishing, whatever you can do to publish, and then keep up your network, like go to conferences, keep talking to people who are at universities. To me, that would be important. And then be sure you can tell the story of why what you're doing in industry would be helpful at the university. So like, I understand how this whole sector works. I understand the research needs from the basic science side. Like those are things you could bring to the table when you're going back to academia. Okay, and then for LCA practitioners in industry, what are things to keep in mind? And finding a balance between time taken to develop models versus accuracy of models. That's a really good question. So for industry setting, things to keep in mind as an LCA person, I would say, from what I've seen, and I've never been an LCA, I did like one LCA as an industry person, so I don't feel like I'm an expert, but I do see a tendency to lean on commercially available software packages for LCA. When you get your results, they just come in like this slug, and it's hard to say like, why is it that way? And in an industry setting, they might not care. They just want to know, is my product better than, like, is my product A better than someone else's product B? But I would just encourage people, or I always encourage people, like to dig into the why, what is behind that number that came out of the commercial software package. Otherwise, to me, it's like, well, I don't know, you didn't really do your homework. You're not able to explain the why behind your result. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And then if you are interested in transitioning back to academia, it's those types of things will help you see what the research needs are in the LCA field, and then convey that I know these challenges exist. I would do research to address those challenges. Time between developing models versus accuracy. Sometimes you really want a quick turnaround results. Like when there's some hot topic in the news, or you want to just like quickly turn around an article, that's a time when you shouldn't worry about developing anything new necessarily. And I struggle with this a lot because in LCA, like you can really get into the weeds on things like spatially for biofuels, when you have your feedstock and you're growing something on a farm. The impacts of doing that in Pennsylvania are different than in Florida, for example, depending on your crop and what's going on. Maybe Pennsylvania and Florida are bad examples because they're very different, but even like Pennsylvania to Iowa, let's say. And so it's hard sometimes to know, like, do I need to capture all that? And I think it comes down to thinking about the research question you're trying to answer and asking yourself if that question requires that level of detail. Because I think like in the past, I've worked with postdocs at Argon, for example, that like the next thing I know, they've like gone and devised this whole complicated, and I'm like, oh, we shouldn't do that because like it's too much, or like we don't actually have that much confidence in that level of detail to then present the results to DOE or whoever else. So sometimes also your level of confidence in the detailed data should dictate like how much you want to use that detail versus just saying like, like conversions around 50% most of the time. So those are the kinds of questions you have to ask yourself. And also comes with experience too, because I didn't know when I started. Anything else? Okay. Somehow I thought I only had half hour for this, but I misread the agenda. I'm sorry. That's why I like raced through. Okay.
Finally, I was able to join the meeting.
Oh.
I think the comment disconnected me to be able to show the screen, which is why, and I hadn't realized that. So that's why I wasn't connected to the internet.
Okay. Okay.
That's why I couldn't go on Zoom.
I have another question.
Yeah.
So I'm not very familiar with the LCA field, but I just wonder when you look at like a very kind of large, complex problem like biofuels, like how do you start that?
Yeah, the very first step is to really understand the question you're asking. So if it's a question of within a biorefinery, if I make a change to my separation step, or if I make a change to the enzyme I'm using or something like this, then you can just draw the box around your refinery and focus there. And then you might want to get really detailed about things like heat integration or water recovery techniques within that biorefinery. Whereas if you're kind of trying to ask the question like, well, can this type of biofuel meet this particular need in the transportation sector, and what are the GHG implications of that? Then you might want to get into the weeds of like, what feedstock am I going to use? Where did it come from? What are the sustainability implications of using that feedstock? So for example, agricultural residue that you take off a cornfield, for example, you think like, well, it's just a waste, like no one's needing it, it's, you know, just sitting there. But it turns out that like we always kind of knew that you can't take it all off because some of it degrades into the soil, puts back carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus back in the soil. But as time went on, people were like, well, we really do need to worry about this, because if you take off some amount of residue, there'll be less carbon in the soil than there would have been if you left it on. So like it's this counterfactual scenario of like an alternative future. And this was being characterized as a carbon debt that you were incurring, because so then we got down to the county level of like, well, how much with soil carbon modeling and land management practices. So we got really detailed on the feedstock side, because that's where a lot of the carbon implications come in. We focused a lot less on the biorefinery. We're like, it's like, you know, roughly this natural gas demand and this electricity demand, and then poof, you've got your product. So if you're really trying to understand like the carbon sinks and sources in a biofuel like system, then you got to get into the feedstock side. But if you're a technology developer and you really just want to know like my feedstock's going to come in the same way no matter what, I'm trying to make my process better, then you can pick detail in the process. Or maybe you want to do really a lot of both. There are people who build very fancy optimization algorithms around like feedstock source and variation in composition over time and from location and into the process and how will the process. I myself haven't done a lot of that because I'm typically interested in asking like much higher level questions. Again, in part because of the whole policy informing thing, and then having DOE as a primary customer for so long. Yeah.
So what advice would you give to a junior faculty member, someone who has recently started as an assistant professor? What would be your piece of advice?
I would say talk to people because a lot of times I think you'll find that some of what you are considering may have, or like your ideas will be informed by their experience, both from like just how to manage your life, but also on the technical side. So at Northwestern, for example, in some ways I am an assistant professor, even though I'm an associate professor, because I'm kind of getting started in this new type of research or doing research with a different perspective. And people are like, oh, 30 years ago, so-and-so did this thing that I had no concept of, because I just haven't, my world with this field kind of started in 2010, and anything before that, I'm not really familiar with. And then since I stepped a little bit back from research in 2017, I'm a little bit behind on the literature since then. So talking to people really helps. And even though honestly, I don't actually I'd like to kind of read papers and be in my own office, and even more so now since the pandemic, I had to get used to talking to people again. But I think that brings a lot of value. And I don't know if any of you have ever read this. It was an article from a while ago, but it was called the 7-year sabbatical, 7-year postdoc, sorry.
I think I have read it.
Okay.
Was it on the Chronicles of Higher Education or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah. I don't remember what was it about though? What was it saying?
She was basically saying,
Annual.
yes.
7-year postdoc.
Mhm. And she was looking at so she was at MIT, I think.
Yeah.
And so it's pretty competitive, right, to get tenure there. And so she said her mindset was 7-year postdoc, and she's here to do the best and the most science that she can. And she also had young children. And so she really talked about how she kind of organized her days. And she said that she didn't travel that much, right? She didn't go to that many conferences. She said there's so many really obviously bright people at MIT. She really focused on getting to know people where she was and building collaborations with them and being informed by their knowledge. And so I think that informs a lot of my thinking. Like same thing at Northwestern, there's a lot of really great people who I in part got to know because of my director of research appointment. So I got to talk with them about what are your research questions and challenges? And I just couldn't help it, because as they were talking to me about what they wanted to do, I was thinking about how does sustainability fit in? How does LCA fit in? Sometimes not at all, but often there was a connection there. I'm like, huh. And then when something would come up a few months later, like a funding opportunity, I'd be like, hey, remember when you told me about thing X? Do you want to write a proposal? And so just having those conversations, it might take a year or sometimes even 2, but they know you, you know them, and that can help build up your research portfolio. The other thing is I could be wrong about this, but what I've been seeing is that in particular, NSF is looking more and more for interdisciplinary work. So that's another reason why talking to people, even if they're not in your immediate discipline, can really help, because you can demonstrate this whole thing about convergence that they're interested in, you're not working as a chemical engineer, material science engineer, and a computer scientist, you're working as a team in which your knowledge has converged around these different fields. And it's you're somewhat indistinguishable from each other, which is, I don't know, I'm still struggling with how to explain this concept of convergence, even to myself. So I think that making those connections is just invaluable. And I actually just finished a course from the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity, NFC.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Did you do which course did you do?
I did the faculty boot camp.
Okay, yeah, and how was that?
It was very interesting.
Uh-huh.
So, because I had the fall quarter, I'm not teaching, so I'm like, all right, I want to learn how should I be doing things maybe differently than I've done them in the past in this new role. So they have basically, if you want to be in this program, they ask you a lot of questions about your career stage and what you want to get out of it. So they work with very junior professors all the way through to tenured people who are kind of I want to figure out what I want to do next, in terms of just, do I want to be an administrator? Do I want to, those types of questions. So you're placed in a small group, and my small group had one person who had a very similar career path to mine. But she had been in France at National Labs, and she had moved back to Canada to be near her family. And she was tenure track, right? So like me, close to tenure, but not fully tenured. And so I really appreciated knowing someone else in my same boat who had a very similar experience with being used to things a certain way at National Labs, now being at a university, and having some of the same questions and being somewhat clueless about some things about how university works. And then we had one person who was a dental faculty in Oregon very different world. They actually have to see patients. I'm like, I can't even imagine, like on top of everything else, dealing with people, like real people and their dental problems. And then there was a library science person. It was a tenure track library position, and she had just had a baby. So it was a very mixed group. And in some ways, I wish that I had had a group that was fully like scientists and engineers, but nonetheless, it was, very supportive, and they kind of like give you some concepts around making a strategic plan. So for like every semester, or in my case, quarter, you should kind of have a plan for the main things you want to get done at the end. And at the National Labs, we always have for every project an annual operating plan, and every quarter has a like things you're supposed to do, and then there's deliverables you got to hand over, and they have to be like smart milestones and all this, right? So that's kind of where I came from, and it's much less, even though I do have DOE funded projects and those types of documents exist for those projects, there's so much else going on. I have 2 service roles, and I have and now I'll be teaching, and so this discipline of making a strategic plan, they kind of teach you how to do it. They give you a way to do it. And I was like, okay, like this is the very concrete steps, as opposed to just to kind of like writing down some practice for the end of the quarter. And then they talk about, like, they have you block your time out for 1 week in 15-minute increments. You see like where are you spending your time. I spend too much time on email. And what else? And they kind of talk to you about like the importance of a daily writing practice, which then I pushed down to my group. I'm like, everybody needs to write for half an hour a day. And if you're having trouble with that, then get an accountability partner. And people have now told me, like, oh, that really helps. Like just writing, even if I'm not working on a paper where you don't have a paper like in the immediate pipeline, just starting to write about stuff is really helpful. I'm like, yeah, it's really helpful. So just being intentional about these things.
But I guess my biggest question is about the deliverable. So first of all, I'm looking for this program myself. I think I'm going to do it. I don't know if next semester, but the next one, maybe the next one. I know they offer it in the summer as well.
They do.
So I read about it, and I'm going to do it. But the big question is about, the strategic planning approach, which is great, right? I do a lot of planning myself, but then it always happens that when it comes to the time where, I don't know, this is the time that I had set as, like a key milestone, or this is the time when we will be delivering results, then things are just not ready. So how did you approach it? This is just out of curiosity. How did you approach it when you were at the National Lab? And like, how would you do it right now? Like, how do you, of course, you have to adjust constantly. You cannot kind of define this plan at the beginning of the year and then just think that it's going to be fixed. But there has to be some accountability as well within the plan, right? You don't move the deadlines. Like, how do you move forward? And you don't move the deadlines all the time.
Yeah, I mean, so at the National Labs, like DOE is kind of looking over your shoulder, and that's very motivating. Like you're like, I need to get this done by December 31. Like that's the end of the first quarter, is December 31. So I've definitely spent, like I remember being on the phone with someone on Thanksgiving, like trying to figure something out. And so, but it's super motivating because you're like, this is our plan, we have to do it. And if you don't meet a milestone, that is a big deal. So we both know Meltem Ergen-Demirtas at Argon. She has my former role in terms of coordinating all the research funded by this one group at DOE. And if you know someone's not going to meet a milestone, this is immediately like a stress point, like, oh my gosh, like, what are we going to do? So you can try and like renegotiate the milestone. And often DOE is very understanding and will do that, but it's not taken lightly. Whereas with NSF funded projects, it's like, oh, in year 3, I said I would do something like this, so it's much more self motivated. And I am actually still struggling with that a little bit because I don't have that full structure. So I can tell a student like, well, I want to be like, I would like to have a full draft of this paper by the end of December, which I've said. But then I'm leaning on that person to kind of do it. But I'm learning like I need to provide a little more, pushing and guidance around that so that I get it. So I have a draft. I'm going to read it on the plane home, but like the very first piece of it. But it's a little bit harder for me because I find myself driven by the things that do have deadlines. And so when you make a self deadline, though, it's just still not for me as motivating as when someone else has now told me. Like I will bend over backwards to meet other people's deadlines. I'm like, yep, you wanted that by this day, and here it is. But when it's my own deadline, I'm like, oh, well, these 3 people also want something from me, so I'll just shove my own stuff aside. And I think as an academic, that becomes less tenable than it was at the National Lab. The other thing at the National Lab, you have more resources you can redirect. So whereas at the university, you've got your students, they're doing something, you can't be like, hey, drop that. Now we need to do this thing. At least I don't think that's that works well. I mean, I'm in year one of this, so we'll see if I'm wrong. Yes, and even postdocs, I've asked postdocs at Northwestern to kind of help me out in short-term things. And I still feel kind of guilty about that because I don't want to get in the way of their publishing and going on to their next step by like, oh, hey, will you help me do this like very small side project, that we may or may not get a paper out of, but it needs to get done. Like I try to limit that, but at the National Lab, I wouldn't think twice. I'd be like, okay, like so you drop whatever this was, you have to pick that up later. So it's a very different sort of management style. And I get calls from companies who will want an LCA done in like 3 months.
Right.
I just can't. I'm like, so I give them the Argon's number. I'm like, call them because they can do that. I can't do it. But so I think it's a challenge for everyone. And when I look at this strategic plan I wrote at the beginning of the quarter, I laugh because I was going to have like 4 more papers done. Yeah.
And so maybe there was nothing in the faculty boot camp that helped with that specific project, which I feel, at least personally, is one of the ones that I mostly struggle with.
Their advice is to be more realistic about how long things take.
Which
And then
you say, oh, I'm just going to do paper.
yeah, I mean, there's in a way they're saying like in a way that affects things, right? So if you don't have that paper out, then maybe you're not going to get that grant. So then you wouldn't write that grant.
Right.
You would instead focus on something else. So, and this is a Women in Energy series.
Right.
One thing that was interesting to me in this whole boot camp, that I only saw females. And I was like, where are the men? And they have, you can do some personal coaching. And of all the personal coaches they have available, only one was a man. And he's actually the one I talked to. You have to set up the appointments like 2 weeks in advance, and I couldn't even keep on top of that. So I only got one in the 12 weeks. But when they asked for comments at the end, I was kind of like, it was kind of weird to not be around any men. I'm like, I think you should get more men involved in your mentors because I'm like, it seems like just that it's only women who are invested in faculty development and diversity. Like you need to have some more men because I know that's not true. I obviously have a lot of male, but you can't help it. In engineering, you're gonna have a lot of male mentors. So I'm like, I know that there are people interested in this. You should find some of them and get them on your staff. But so overall, like, I'm glad I did it, but I would say it didn't necessarily live up to all my expectations. Yeah, I mean, what else? They kind of talked about, the last part was like viewing your career as chapters, which of course I had no problem with. I'm like, yes, my whole life has been chapter to chapter to chapter. So, yes, but I could see it, coming in as a very young professor being like, okay, I have like these 30 years. That's a long time. Like as a younger person, you might not see how much your career can change over time. Even staying at one institution for 30 years, you can have a lot of variety. And I think for some of the younger people in the group, that was helpful. The write a reflection that was done in like 3 minutes because I was like, this is my life. I just have chapters. And I'm already thinking like, okay, when I retire, I want to grow bonsai trees. I want to travel here. I want to do, so I'm easily able to think of what I want to do next. But I'm also older now. So when I was in my 20s, I was like, I don't know. And I knew that everybody else, not everyone, but many of my classmates were in similar states of mental anguish because they just didn't know what they wanted to do. So.
Well, this was great. Thank you for sharing your experience. I wasn't expecting this to come up. But I think it's it's also for junior faculty members.
It is, and they also have some programs for PhD students and postdocs. I think primarily around for PhDs is on writing your dissertation. So they're very big on accountability around daily writing, and so I think they do some stuff with that, and also for postdocs. So Northwestern has an institutional membership.
Right, Penn State does not.
Okay.
So you have to do it yourself.
You have to do it yourself. I mean, I had to pay out of my startup funds. I did it for the boot camp.
Yeah.
But they have like 14-day writing challenges I've done in the past, where like you get a little gold star when you log your time that you've written. And I am very motivated by gold stars, it turns out still. Like in the preschool class, and they give you like a gold star. And I'm still motivated by gold stars. So I was like, yes, I have 5 this week, so yeah. But so it did help, and it helped me get a paper like over the hump to submission. For the like last year, I think I did it. And they give you a little certificate at the end. So
No, I think it's good. I have a friend and former friend from grad school. She's also an associate professor, and she did it last year. And she was very happy with it, but because I think it really helped her plan a little bit better. But maybe for someone like you who has more of the planning brain or kind of in her mind, then like you said, maybe it didn't live up to expectations because you were thinking that it would provide a little bit more insights into the specific issue that we were discussing just right now. And that's what I would be hoping for. Yeah.
I think
have some ideas to tackle that specific problem, but it's not an easy thing to.
It's not easy. It's not easy at all. I mean, I know very few people who are like, every plan I make, I finish everything at the end.
But maybe coming close, right?
Yes. Yes.
In some cases, we missed the target by quite a few months.
And I'm still learning, to me, the difference between working with postdocs and students, right? So at Argon, you don't really have graduate students, you have postdocs, and they've already been through a PhD program. So you're like, here's all the stuff you need to read, then I want you to make some equations and tell me what's missing. And then they go off and they do it for the most part, but with a student, you need to really lay out things more. And I'm really fortunate to work with really bright students. So it's not like, but I'm learning still like what context is needed that's not needed when someone's been through a PhD program. So, but it's really fun. One of my students just went to COP26. So she was away for a couple weeks, but that's something I didn't know. It was not in my strategic plan. I didn't know she was going to go. And it basically took out a month because she had to prepare, because she did some ethnographic research while she was there. She had to prepare and like do all the training on the institutional review board stuff, and then go. And then like those 2 weeks were really intense for her, because every night she had to write up her field notes and things like that. So I was like, okay, I just gave up like a month of her time, which was not in my little plan. So I have to revisit the plan. I was telling you, like, I need to revisit my plan. So yeah, for her project in particular.
Well, that's great. Again, thanks for sharing.
Yeah, definitely.
Other questions? I don't see, anything from the.
Oh, I see a question. Sorry, I'm not seeing it. About social LCA. There are guidelines from the United Nations that were revised in 2020, and those I would look at first. That's the kind of like the foundational documents around social LCA. Actually, one of my case studies that I'm going to talk about this afternoon is about social LCA. So it's something that I'm still learning as well. And as I mentioned, like being at Northwestern let me kind of pursue that, whereas I might not have been able to do that at the national lab. And I got to work with an anthropologist. So that's always fun for me to learn about new fields. But I would say that report is really great. And I don't know, for me, one struggle with social LCA has been like a lot of the papers are very kind of theoretical. And it's like I read them and I come away thinking like, I don't understand what you're saying, because I'm used to the world of environmental LCA where we've got like equations and ways to like lay things out in a system boundary and everything is very clear. And I feel like SLCA is still a very young area, and so there's still a lot of room for methodology development. But this new 2020 set of guidelines reflects, I would say, the last 10 years of that. That's a good place to start. And you can follow that group that puts that out. You can follow them on Twitter and then you get kind of their updates. It's a good use of social media.
If there's no more questions from the audience, then I guess we'll end it here. Thank you so much for sharing your path and a lot of your insights and experience with us. And then, of course, we look forward to your seminar this afternoon, right?
Yeah.
Network we have a little less time than before,
Correct.
3:30, and then your seminar will be at 4.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know, yeah, you have your presentation and where if you can email it to me. then I'll
Okay.
say that I'm gonna be speaking.
Sounds good.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.